Hello everyone, welcome in. My name is Everetta, and this lively pile of bones next to me is my bestie Maury. And this is part 2 in the Tide Trilogy summary series. In part 1, I gave a recap on everything that happened in the main story during the Tide of Shadows event, so if you haven't seen that yet, go check it out and come back. In this video, I'll be summarizing the main story during the Tide of Corruption event. And just like last time, I'll put some links in the description if you'd like to listen to the full chapter narrations or read them. All right, let's dive in. The story of the Tide of Corruption takes place in the game's present day and begins with letters written by Sophia to Lulu Bassett. In the letters, Sophia tells Lulu that she is in the company of 3 other hunters, the Reaper, Wormbite, and the Bone Mason. All 4 of them connected by pain and anger that death has chosen them to come back to life while ignoring the people they care about, or in the Reaper's case, undoing all his hard work. Together, they forged the Death Pact and possess the ability to see the dead through their dark sight. They agree to work together to find out more about the land of the dead, how to travel there, and how to keep the coffins closed for good. At the end of the first letter, Sophia tells Lulu that she misses her, and when she closes her eyes, she sees her sweetly. And then she sees a skull painted on the wings of a moth. She sees an alligator eat that moth. She sees a boat eat the alligator. She sees 1,000 fires eat the boat. She sees the night eat the fires. And then she sees a sculpture. She rips the tongue out of it, and then rips the tongue out of everything. On their mission to find answers about the land of the dead, the group passes a body and recognizes it to be the hunter known as the Kid. He was floating at the docks, swaddled in pig meat, straw, and pumpkins, and was missing half of his face. They watched as the water and mud parted like a mouth and swallowed him away. Continuing on, the Death Pact meets Mama May, who has a new flower in her garden that could give them answers. Mama May takes them to the garden, but what they see isn't exactly a flower, but instead a piece of wood in a planter leaning against a tomato trellis. The wood had a crooked spine growing out of it, a skull, and a half-flesh, half-wooden face that blinked at them. They realized it was debris from the cursed ship, the Delphine. Sophia began the interrogation, demanding to know the wood's name, but the face spit seawater at her. After trying a couple different methods to get the wood to talk to them, the Reaper took his scythe and began to poke it into the wood's skull, causing it to scream. The Wormbite spots a work coat with the name Jellicoe on the name tag. Side note, I didn't read off the names of the passengers and crew members on the ship's log for the Delphine in the Tide of Shadows summary video, but Jellicoe was listed as a crew member on that log. Using the wood's name, Wormbite asks him how the ship was hexed. Crying, the wood replied, "There is a dead land underwater. I've been there forever. All the dead have too. A storm dragged us there. It's ruled by an insect on the moon with a brain among the stars and a body as hollow as air." Jellicoe goes on to explain how they brought Rotjaw on board and fed her the relic, describing it as an artifact, a holy stone, and a god larva. The ship then absorbed everybody on board before crossing through Death's mouth. And now Death is almost out of the kind of death that they want it to give them. The Wormbite asks how they can break the stone, and Jellicoe replies that Mr. Finch would know, because he's the reason they had the stone on board the Delphine. Jellicoe then starts chanting a single word over and over: drown, drown, drown. Mama May places the planter on a cart, telling Jellicoe it's time for his pruning, while they leave the room, and the Death Pact listens to the sound of wood screaming. With this new information about this mysterious stone and Mr. Finch, the Death Pact tracks him down to an abandoned house. They ask him where he's been, and he tells them he's been killing time. He stepped down as director of the American Hunters Association to find answers. The captain of the Delphine was supposed to deliver the stone to him, but failed. So Finch went looking for a way to stop everything that's happening, and how it's been stopped before. In his search, he learned that he has ancient blood that hails back to a time of cave paintings and the deep rumbling wells of the earth. Sophia says that he's lying. He's running from death and went to enjoy himself. Finch agrees that he's made mistakes, including valuing his own life, but he regrets allowing Cherry to set his plans in place while he was away. He continues to explain that now the Demented Pack think he's blocking them from ascension. The Grounded Pack thinks that he's summoned Rotjaw. Everyone wants him dead, except for the Death Pact standing before him. There's no stopping him being caught because he's in everyone's way. Sophia asks how he can still help. Finch replies, with sacrifice. He knows where Cherry is going and how they can make him lose. He hands Sophia 3 vials of pure and ancient silver filled with his blood and tells her he's charging her with his final task. There will be one opening. Don't miss. At the end of the letter to Lulu, Sophia writes, I've etched your name on the vials. You know I never miss. While the Death Pact has been searching for information about the land of the dead, the Demented Pack has been hard at work with tasks of their own. In a notebook filled with near-illegible writing, a hunter named Reginald Villemont writes about his vows to the sculptor. He recounts the night of the 3-pack showdown at the Delphine, Gar banishing Rotjaw, and the smugglers being too distracted with their desire to loot guns and gold to notice he took the stone from Rotjaw's corpse. Some people call the stone a relic or artifact, but Reginald says, it's the murmur stone. Only the demented can hear its scripture. The stone spoke to Reginald, and he pulled a steaming cleaver from its mouth. Then the stone told him to take the cleaver to the butcher's den, the temple of meat and flame. So Reginald gathered his skeptical followers and led them to the slaughterhouse. He held the cleaver to the sky, and divine lightning crashed down on him, burning those who tried to flee. He breathed them in and turned them into more fire inside the murmur blade. Reginald carried the cleaver outside. The once skeptical, now turned into true believers, kissed his boot prints. Flames from the cleaver spread to the ground and the trees in search of the land's most precious hidden parts. Reginald has now become the butcher's cleaver and proclaims that he will be the edge that pries apart those secrets. And when the world's skull splits open, he will not look away. He will drink from it. The next entry in the notebook talks about the hunter known as the Kid. The beast hunter brought the Kid, wrapped up in barbed wire, to the butcher's cleaver and tossed him to the ground. He said he found him sniffing around and trapping their altars. Picking the Kid up and putting him on their new altar, the butcher's cleaver asks, you know what we do with sniffers? We remove the tool that sniffs. He then asked the Kid why he thought the altar gave them the gifts and explained it's because they're ants, that they're worthless without direction. The butcher's cleaver then grabbed a follower, one he claimed to know was a false believer, and tossed him to the ground before stomping his skull over and over. He then retrieved a dead, rotting piglet. A follower on her knees, with brushes and dyes scattered around her, asked if the sculptor would turn them into art. The butcher's cleaver replied yes. And then using his fingers, he marked the follower's forehead with the rotting juices of the piglet, declaring that they would gut and slash and slaughter and maul and bite and tear and bash their heads into hollows that heads weren't meant to hollow inside of. The followers chanted, "We'll scream inside their bodies a prayer to set us free." The butcher's cleaver then squeezed the rest of the piglet's juices into the mouth of the murmur stone. It hummed and delivered his intentions. He then pressed his shotgun to the Kid's face and said, "Let's turn you into paint." After this incident, the butcher's cleaver has a meeting with a couple of scrappers named Morgan and Midian. The 2 lovebirds were adorned with trash and totems and holding a wingless crow in their hands. Before speaking, the butcher's cleaver held out another piglet, this time one that was still alive. He kissed its freshly sewn shut eyes and squeezed it tight until it squealed, allowing him to bite its tongue and rip it out. He fed the tongue to the scrapper's crow, forging a bond between them. The pair explained to him that their work is stagnant and stuck because the old leader of the hunt is blocking them, gobbling their prayers. The butcher's cleaver says the name of the man they're speaking of is Finch. Morgan and Midian confirm and say Finch is a false bird and false leader, and that he blocks them from the pathways their scrapbeak uses. The butcher's cleaver replies that Finch used to lead them all fair and true, and that he admired him, but now he's clipped their wings. They placed the piglet and the crow in a rift nest and shushed them to sleep, sealing them away for now, knowing that when Finch dies, they would carry their wishes to their lord and the pathways would be cleared. Meanwhile, as the fires set by the Demented Pack continue to spread across the bayou, the Infernal Pact arrives to fight fire with fire. In a forestry burn log, the burnt marshal describes the raging fire, as he and Henry, also known as the Devil's Advocate, search for signs of Mr. Cherry. They climbed onto a lookout platform and witnessed some members of the Demented Pack at Seven Sisters Estate, placing the banished remains of the butcher onto a pyre and crawling around on all fours, grunting, hopping, and biting at each other. Suddenly, a maniacal laugh came from behind them as a demented follower climbed up the ladder with a carved pumpkin on his head. The carving was ornate and depicted a steamboat being dragged to hell, an alligator vomiting rain, foul insect limbs holding up a sculpture above a barn. The burnt marshal recognized the barn. This was the sign they needed. They removed the pumpkin from the follower's head before forcing a flare gun into his mouth, pulling the trigger and watching the horrific aftermath. The burnt marshal and the devil's advocate arrived at the barn along with other members of the infernal pact, like the private eye, the black coat, and the captain. Burnt marshal showed them the pumpkin and told them it was a message from Cherry. The private eye inspected it closer and pointed out the moon phases in the carving, along with Fort Karmic and pigs kissing the Murmurstone, concluding that Mr. Cherry wants them to lay siege to the slaughterhouse tomorrow. However, their meeting is interrupted when the devil's advocate sniffs the air and asks what the hell that smell is. They heard some muffled screeching and looked up to see the pale, gnarled toes of Cain over the edge of the roof boards, and Monroe next to him holding a sack. They dumped a hive out of the sack onto the infernal pact below. The hive released her bees, poisoning the infernals and killing their supply of fire beetles. As they escape the barn, the burnt marshal spots a wingless crow riding a piglet's back. The next entry in the forestry burn log, the burnt marshal describes the siege on Slaughterhouse. As bullets sprayed out from the lair, the infernals pushed forward, tossing jugs of flammables to spread the fire. The flames healed the fire pact as the bullets pierced them. The burnt marshal made it inside and found the Murmurstone enshrined just like the carving on the pumpkin showed. Lorona threw a sticky bomb at the shrine to collapse it, and the burnt marshal grabbed the stone before running to the roof where he met Butcher's Cleaver standing face to face with Mr. Cherry. Cherry asked the Butcher's Cleaver, "Don't you wonder why the sculptor let you unleash the inferno, only for us to be healed by it?" The Butcher's Cleaver roared in response. The burnt marshal used this moment to jump off the roof and escape into the woods with the Murmurstone. But as he ran, the stone whispered to him, saying, "Drown, drown, drown." Sometime after this night, Finch's prediction of being caught becomes reality as we read transcripts from recordings made by Mr. Cherry himself. In these recordings, he speaks about wrapping Finch with a rope and hanging him from a beam over a sinkhole. Mr. Cherry had a table set for two with flowers, candle, and a meal of duck and beignets. As Finch hung, he told Cherry that he heard that he was afraid of clouds and asked if it was true. Pain flared in Cherry's leg at the mention of it, but he didn't answer his question, instead telling Finch not to be cruel because he'd like this to be a kind goodbye. Mr. Cherry sat down at the table and Finch noticed the dinner, commenting that it was the same dinner they had when Cherry signed onto the organization. Mr. Cherry admitted that he was a bit sentimental and wondered what would happen next between them and if he'd gone too far. Finch pointed out that a normal man would just stop. Cherry replied that a normal man doesn't learn magic tricks. He took out a bullet and showed it to Finch. He then rubbed it, and it swept off into the air, spun, held still in the breeze, and then glided down into the chamber of his revolver. Finch told Cherry that he would applaud if he could, and he replied, "No need." Mr. Cherry then described the pit below to be ghastly deep with strange things moving at the bottom, and Finch told him he'd say hello to his friends down there. The two say their goodbyes, and then Cherry shoots the rope. Now Cherry feels free to do as he pleases, with Finch being drowned at the bottom of the pit, his blood sealed inside him, and no one else possessing the same kind of blood needed to banish the Murmurstone. So he begins the next stage of his plan. What we find out is that his goal has been to open a permanent passageway to the land of the dead, so that he can pass through as he pleases. Mr. Cherry describes his own trips to the land of the dead and what he learned from those events. His first trip was an accident. It happened when entities of infernal sensibility spread flames, burning a city. When the flames burned through a person, their shadows forged pathways. So he secured passage to the land of the dead by walking on the ashes of 100 merchants. However, his second time going there, when he boarded the Delphine, wasn't so easy for him. A live body isn't able to travel straight through a rift. He had to be cut into pieces, passed down into the dead world's waters. He adds that he will not relive such a shame again. What he learned during these trips was that symbols carry weight and souls do not disappear. They can be baited and misdirected, and their energies can be exploited. With this information, he plans out a theatrical play. He stands by as the burnt marshal, Hawkshaw Jack, and the captain with his new crew heave on ropes that pass through a rift, attempting to pull Rotjaw's shackles from the other side. Mr. Cherry begins to grow impatient and tells the men to pull harder. Hawkshaw drops the ropes and tells Mr. Cherry they'll pull the shackles out faster if he tells them why he uses the cane he carries around. Mr. Cherry replies that when he was a boy, a cloud tried to kill him. The captain asks him how, and in response, Cherry speared his cane through the captain's eye and into his skull. The captain's body fell to the ground and then was swallowed by the rift. Then Mr. Cherry said, "Anything can kill you if it has will and agency. Now, pull those ropes. The men finished pulling the shackles out of the rift, and using the captain's map, they made their way to their next destination, the remains of the Delphine. They collected debris from the ghost ship that contained souls trapped within the wood, and then used it to construct a stage to perform their play. Next, roles were assigned. The Black Coat played the role of Finch, strung up from a branch. Private Eye played the steamboat captain, spinning a wheel nailed to a tree. And the Devil's Advocate crawled around wearing a makeshift gator mask. The symbology was in place. The soul of the navigator existed inside the Delphine's debris, longing for dead waters. The soul of Finch yearned for the Murmurstone, and Rotjoss sought her master as well. The feelings and emotions of these souls provided fuel, but it was bait. Mr. Cherry activated Rotjoss' shackles and shoved the Murmurstone inside of them, instantly creating a permanent passageway to the land of the dead. However, Mr. Cherry's celebration was cut short by an ambush from the Death Pact. Wormbite began sniping people on deck. The Reaper stabbed his scythe into necks. The Bone Mason shot holes into people with precision. And Sophia rose from the creek with a crossbow in hand. She took aim and fired a bolt. Mr. Cherry ducked just in time to avoid being hit, but she wasn't aiming for him. The bolt flew past him, puncturing the veil and into the passageway, splattering the vial of Finch's blood against the mouth of the Murmurstone, banishing it. Dead arms reached out of the portal, splitting the shackles, the stage, and the ground as they grasped for Chari's cane. It was the captain of the Delphine, emerging with his spine bent at sharp angles and smelling of sulfur. This was the start of a new age, and its name was Desolation. And that sums up the main story of the Tide of Corruption. Again, there are other side pieces of lore from the characters and weapons that we can go over, but I'll make those into separate videos. There is a little bit more information from the chapters about the Murmurstone, though. I set the information to the side because I didn't want to break up the flow of events happening in the story. In one of the chapters, Chari talks about the Murmurstone, describing it as an ancient library of tales, having been present for the Knights Templar, Cleopatra, Napoleon, and so on. Stone says it can only speak the truth and was ready to tell Mr. Chari all sorts of tales of men and women. But Chari isn't interested in that story. He wants to hear about the nameless silver scarab Goliath, who pulped insectoid maidens into Mercury at the first age of the sculptor. Also mentioning that there are fables of worms endlessly burrowing across desolate lands, sludging in unison, charting pathways and inscribing memories for a mind too big to shroud a single sky. But ultimately, what he really wants to know, the Murmurstone hasn't answered, possibly because he isn't asking the right question. It's not what the sculptor wants, but why. In another chapter, Mr. Cherry is with the Private Eye and asks her if she's been to the city of Bath. She says she's been there once, and he goes on to tell her that the Roman bathing pools in Bath were used to heat a unique kind of quicksilver. The silver was used to feed abominations bonded with the sculptor, and then they used them to summon calamities and overthrow empires. The creatures made a sound, the sound of continents halving in two. It was a call to mark the end of an age. Mr. Cherry then says he's now heard this sound and wants to see if it's time for such a thing to transpire. And we get the answer to his question, because if you remember when Finch gave Sophia the vials, they were made from pure and ancient silver. Sophia then shot the bolt into the mouth of the Murmurstone, which was a creature bonded with the sculptor, causing the ground to split as the dead made its way through, which is a great setup for the Tide of Desolation, the third and final part of the Tide Trilogy. But I still have a lot of questions. When the Murmurstone gets banished, Mr. Cherry expresses frustration that now he doesn't have his passageway to the land of the dead. So in banishing it, did they instead just open a one-way rift that the dead can pass through? In the Tide of Desolation, we'll see some deceased hunters make their way back to the land of the living. But which ones? Will the story tell us about each one returning, or will there be some surprises later? And if the hunters can't use this to get to the land of the dead, what is the Death Pact going to do next? I guess we'll find out in part 3 when I summarize the Tide of Desolation. But let me know your thoughts. In the last video, a lot of you expressed wanting to know more information about Mr. Cherry, so I've added him to the list of lore videos to make. Tell me what other lore videos you'd like to see. And in the meantime, if you'd like to see some of my gameplay content, feel free to follow me on Twitch. I currently exclusively stream Hunt every Friday and Sunday at 7 p.m. Pacific, and I am an official Hunt content creator, so I often have free DLC giveaways during my streams. Sometimes I play teams, but I mostly stream solo versus trio matches, so swing by and say hi. Thanks for watching, and may your enemies' flare guns be out of ammo. Bye.